The call came on a Thursday afternoon in November, while I was standing in a hardware store holding a bag of tile adhesive and trying to remember whether I'd already bought grout. My phone buzzed against my hip, and when I looked at the screen it said Dad, which was unusual enough. He was not a man who called in the middle of the day, or much at all, that I set the tile adhesive down on the nearest shelf and answered. "I need you to come home this weekend," he said. No preamble. No how are you. Just that, in the flat, compressed voice he used when something had already been decided and he was notifying rather than asking. "Is something wrong?" I said. A pause. "We'll talk when you get here." He hung up before I could ask anything else. "My name is Emory. I'm 44 years old. I live about 2 hours from the town where I grew up. Not far enough to be a genuine departure, close enough to carry most of what I came from. I run a small joinery business with 2 employees and a waiting list I'm quietly proud of. I have a flat above a converted mill, a good life assembled from modest materials, and a family that was the particular kind of complicated that most families are if you're honest about them. My father is Leonard. He is 71 years old, a retired civil engineer, a man of careful habits and scarce words and opinions held with the quiet permanence of load-bearing structures. He remarried 9 years ago, after my mother died. A woman named Celia, 15 years younger than him, warm in a surface way that I'd always found slightly opaque. My brother Marcus is 39, 5 years younger than me, and he had stayed in the town where we grew up, taken a job at the council, bought a house 2 streets from our father's, and become, over the years, the son who was present. I understood this without resentment. Proximity is its own form of love, and I'd chosen distance. That has consequences. What I did not know, driving home that Friday evening through the flat dark of the November countryside, was that I was arriving at the confluence of 2 separate crises that my father had not yet told me were connected. The first, he had changed his will, 3 weeks earlier, substantially, in Marcus's favor. The second, Celia had left him. Not recently, not that week, not cleanly. She had been leaving for months, in increments I would piece together over the course of that weekend. And she had not left for nothing. She had left for someone. I pulled into my father's driveway at 7 in the evening. The house was lit, kitchen, sitting room, the upstairs landing. Leonard was at the door before I reached it, which he had never been in my memory. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, which had been 3 months earlier at Marcus's birthday. Not dramatically older, just the specific kind of aging that comes from sustained internal pressure rather than time. "Come in," he said. "I've made dinner." He had made a roast, with the methodical precision he brought to all domestic tasks. We sat at the kitchen table and ate mostly in silence, because Leonard communicates in the negative space between sentences, and I had learned long ago to wait in that space rather than fill it. After dinner, he poured 2 glasses of whiskey he never drinks and pushed one toward me. "I changed the will," he said. "I thought you should hear it from me." I picked up the glass. I did not say anything. "Marcus has been here," he said. "All of it. Every year. He's earned what's here." "I know," I said. And I meant it. Or I tried to. He looked at his glass. "Celia's gone," he said, as if it were a secondary matter. As if he had placed it lower on the list deliberately so the weight of it wouldn't surface too soon. I looked at him across the table. He was not a man who showed much. But his hands, flat on the table on either side of his glass, had a stillness that I recognized as the stillness of something being held together by effort. "Gone where?" I said. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the table. And then, in the voice of a man delivering a structural assessment he had already made peace with, he told me. To understand what happened with Celia, I had to understand the marriage, not as I'd observed it from a distance of 2 hours and 3 visits a year, but as it had actually been. And I could only understand that by listening to Leonard, which is something he had never made easy and which, that weekend, he managed in the way he managed most difficult things, in small, separated pieces, offered across hours rather than in one sitting. Leonard and Celia had married 9 years ago. She was 56 then, he was 62. She had been widowed 4 years earlier, a brief marriage to a man named Jeffrey who had died of a cardiac event at 58 and left her with a small settlement and a house she'd subsequently sold. She and Leonard had met through a walking group that his friend Desmond had pressed him to join in the first year after my mother's death. She was organized, sociable, physically active in a way my father was not, and she brought into his quiet life a quality of motion that he, I think, genuinely needed at that point. I had not been unkind to Celia, but I had also not been warm. In the way that children of first marriages sometimes fail to be warm to the person who occupies a space that feels categorically wrong for anyone to occupy. She had not pushed. She'd been, to her credit, consistently decent to me across 9 years without ever pretending we were something we weren't. What Leonard told me, that Friday evening and into the Saturday, was that the first sign had come in the spring. Not a dramatic sign, nothing so simple. Celia had joined a community arts project, a local initiative to restore and repurpose an old mill building into a gallery and community space. It was exactly the kind of project that suited her, organized, socially engaged, requiring the particular competence she had in getting people to work together. She had thrown herself into it with what Leonard described, in his understated way, as considerable energy. The project had a lead volunteer coordinator. His name was Richard. He was 63, roughly Leonard's age, which was one of the details that caught in my chest when I heard it, because it removed the convenient explanation of a younger man's appeal. He was a retired architect, recently divorced, with the particular vitality of someone who had shed something heavy and emerged lighter. Celia had mentioned him to Leonard in the early months of the project. Briefly, practically, the way you mention a colleague whose competence affects your shared work. The mentions became less frequent as the months passed. Leonard noticed this, but filed it. He was not an inattentive man. He was a man who gave the benefit of the doubt as a default, because in his experience most things that looked like warning signs were simply ordinary life in poor lighting. What changed? I asked. She stopped telling me things, he said, not with bitterness, with the precise, careful language of someone describing a structural change. Not important things, small things. The project updates. What happened at the meetings? She used to talk about it. Then she didn't. The evenings changed. Celia had always been the social engine of their household, the one who arranged dinners, suggested films, maintained the calendar of family and friends. In the summer, this engine quietly idled. She was less interested in planning things, more occupied with her phone in the evenings, more likely to go to bed early while Leonard sat in the sitting room with a book he wasn't really reading. Did you ask her about it? I said. He looked at his whiskey. I asked if she was all right. What did she say? She said she was tired. The project was a lot of work. A pause. I believed her. Of course he had. Because it was plausible, and because Leonard had married someone he trusted, and because trust, particularly the settled trust of a long second marriage, is both the most valuable thing in a relationship and the most effective camouflage for its opposite. Marcus, for his part, had noticed things I hadn't. He told me this on the Saturday afternoon, when we sat in his kitchen while his wife Claire made tea and kept a tactful distance. Marcus is observant in the way of someone who has always lived close to a situation. He catches things through proximity that I miss through distance, but he also sometimes lacks the perspective that distance gives. She was different from February, he said. Something in the way she was at Dad's. Like she was passing through, if that makes sense. Like someone who's already decided, I said. Yes, he said. Exactly that. The will, Marcus told me, had been Leonard's idea, not his request, not something Marcus had encouraged or even known about until their father told him, after the fact, that it had been done. This mattered to me. I needed to know whether Marcus had a hand in it, and the answer was no. The answer was that Leonard, watching his marriage quietly losing its structural integrity and not yet understanding why, had turned toward the thing he could still shape, the future of what he'd built, the house, the savings, the material evidence of a life's work. And he had given more of it, most of it, to the son who had stayed. I understood this. I did not love it, but I understood it. What I did not yet understand was Celia's full plan, how far it had already progressed, and who else knew before I did. The picture of what had happened assembled itself over the course of that weekend, and it assembled itself not only through what Leonard told me, but through what I noticed on my own. Celia's presence in the house was reduced in the way of someone who has been removing themselves incrementally over time. Not empty. She hadn't taken everything, but edited. The dressing table in the bedroom had gaps where things had been, a pattern Leonard wouldn't have cataloged but that I, seeing it fresh, registered immediately. Books removed from the shared shelf. Not all of them, just a selection. The kind of removal that happened over weeks, not a single departure. There was a houseplant missing from the sitting room windowsill that I remembered from my last visit. A small ceramic dish from the hallway table that had always held her keys. These were things so small they would barely register. They barely registered to me. But together they described a withdrawal conducted in slow motion, piece by piece, as if testing what would be noticed. Leonard had noticed none of it consciously. Or rather, he had noticed each absence individually, assigned it a benign explanation, and moved on. The plant had been struggling. She'd likely taken it somewhere with better light. The dish had probably been moved during cleaning. This is how people protect themselves from what they're not yet ready to know. I sat in the sitting room that Saturday afternoon while Leonard was in the garden. He gardens the way other men drink, as a management strategy, and I thought about what Marcus had told me, like she was passing through. And I thought about the plant on the windowsill and the ceramic dish and the edited bookshelf. And I thought about Richard, the retired architect who had the particular vitality of someone who had shed something heavy. How long has she been gone? I'd asked Leonard the night before. She told me in September, he said. She left properly in October. Properly, I repeated. She'd been staying with her sister in August. She said she needed space to think. He looked at the table. I thought she was tired. The project, the summer. People need space. So, she had left in August, a preliminary leaving, framed as recuperation, and returned for September, during which she told him, and left again in October. He had been alone in the house since October. 6 weeks by the time I arrived. He had not called me in October. He had not called in September. He had absorbed it, as Leonard absorbed all things, in the private interior where he processed everything alone. The will, I understood now, had been changed in October, the week after she left properly. The connection was not incidental. I called Marcus from the garden that evening, walking along the edge of the lawn while Leonard washed up inside. Did you know about Richard before September? I asked. A pause. I knew there was someone, he said. Not the name. Dad mentioned she'd been spending a lot of time on the project. I put things together. You didn't tell me. You weren't here, he said. Not unkindly. Just as a fact. I stood in the garden with that for a moment. The cold air, the smell of turned earth from the beds Leonard had been working, the lit kitchen window where I could see my father's shape moving with the economical precision of a man who has learned to do everything himself. The will, I said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I tried to tell him it wasn't necessary. But you didn't refuse it. No, he said. I didn't refuse it. We were both quiet. I'm not angry at you, I said. And I wasn't, not exactly. I was something more complicated, something that takes longer to name. The particular feeling of being the child who left, looking at the house you left, and understanding, fully and finally, what leaving costs. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say I gathered proof, because in this case, it wasn't the covert, systematic investigation of a wronged spouse. It was the slower, less dramatic process of a son trying to understand the full architecture of what had happened to his family, what Celia had actually done, how far it had gone, and whether the version Leonard had been given was the complete one. Because Leonard, I suspected, had been given the managed version. He was not a man who invited the full truth. He was a man who received what people calculated he could bear. On Sunday morning, I drove to see Desmond. He was 80, still sharp, the man who had brought Leonard to the walking group 9 years ago, and who had consequently, however unintentionally, introduced him to Celia. He lived in a small terraced house with a large cat and more books than furniture, and he made me tea without being asked and sat across from me with the expression of someone who had been expecting this conversation. You know, I said. Not a question. I know some things, he said carefully. Tell me what you know. He did. Not everything. Desmond was loyal, and loyalty with him was a structural feature rather than a choice. But enough. He had seen Celia and Richard at a garden center in July. Not together in an ambiguous sense, but together in the plain sense, the sense of people whose physical proximity tells a story that doesn't need words. He had said nothing to Leonard because, in his judgment, it wasn't yet certain enough to cause that pain without purpose. By the time it was certain, Celia had already told Leonard herself. Was he relieved? I asked. When she told him herself, rather than finding out another way? Desmond thought about this. I think he was devastated, he said. And I think the devastation looked like relief because Leonard doesn't know how to show devastation. I nodded. I knew this. I had grown up with it. The will, I said. Desmond looked at his tea. He called me the day after she left. Told me what he was doing. I told him to think about it. He said he had thought about it. What did he mean by it, do you think? What was he trying to do? Desmond was quiet for a moment. I think, he said, slowly, that he was trying to make sure something he'd built survived intact. He couldn't keep the marriage together. He couldn't make her stay. But he could make sure the house, what he'd worked for, what your mother helped build, didn't get complicated, didn't get caught in something legal and contested. I thought about this on the drive back. The will wasn't about Marcus, not really. It wasn't even about me. It was about Leonard trying to protect something from the possibility of Celia making a legal claim on it, which, after 9 years of marriage, she might have been positioned to do. He had moved quietly, in the only direction he knew how to move, toward structure, toward protection, toward something he could still control. Whether Celia had any such intention, I didn't know. I wasn't sure Leonard did either. I think he acted out of fear, and fear in Leonard's case didn't look like fear. It looked like engineering. The last piece arrived through Claire, Marcus's wife, who told me over Sunday lunch, when the men were out of the room, that Celia's sister had called Marcus's house by mistake 3 weeks earlier, looking for Celia's new address. She'd mentioned, in the confused brief conversation before realizing her error, that Celia was settling in well, and that Richard's house had a lovely garden. She was living with him. She had been since October. She had not told Leonard this. She had told him she'd moved to her sister's temporarily. Leonard was alone in his house, 6 weeks into believing his wife was at her sister's, grieving a marriage in the form he'd been given, the honest version with an edited geography. I sat with Claire across the table for a moment. Then I said, "Does Marcus know?" "Yes," she said. "He didn't want to tell your dad. He didn't know how." I nodded. I knew how that felt. I'd spent the whole weekend trying to figure out when to say what, and in what order, and how much protection the full truth was actually worth. I told Leonard on Sunday evening. I sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same 2 glasses, though this time neither of us poured anything, and I told him what I knew. Not everything at once. In the order that was least like an ambush. I told him about the garden center in July, that Desmond had seen them together before September, before the sisters' visit, before the space Celia said she'd needed, that the beginning of it was earlier than the timeline she'd given him. He listened without expression. Then I told him she wasn't at her sister's. He was quiet for a long time. The kitchen clock made its small sound. Callum, his dog, a 14-year-old lab who had been present for more of our family's history than most people, shifted under the table. "How long has she been there?" he said. "Since October," I said. "Since she left." He nodded very slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected and had not let himself believe. "She told me the sisters," he said, not with anger, with the flat precision of someone entering a fact into the record. "I know," I said. "Why?" he said, and it was the smallest I'd ever heard his voice. I thought about what Desmond had said. He couldn't make her stay. I thought about Richard, the retired architect, and the house with a lovely garden. I thought about what it costs to tell someone who is already in pain that the wound is shaped differently than they thought. "I think she was protecting herself," I said. "And I think she may have been protecting you, in the way people do when they can't quite face the full truth of what they're doing." "That's a generous reading," he said. "Yes," I said. He looked at the table. "And Marcus knew." "Yes." "He didn't tell me." "No. He didn't know how." Leonard absorbed this. His hands on the table. The stillness that was not peace. "I'm not angry at Marcus," he said finally. "I know. I'm not sure what I am." "That's all right," I said. "You don't have to be something specific right now." He looked up at me then, briefly, with an expression I hadn't seen on him since I was very young. Not vulnerability, exactly. More like the moment just before a person decides to let something be said. "I changed the will before she told me where she was," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know," I said. "Desmond told me you did it the week after she left. But you think it was about protecting the house." "I think it was about fear," I said. "And I understand fear." He looked at me for a long moment. Then, "I'm sorry," he said, "for how I did it. I should have talked to you." In 44 years, my father had said sorry to me twice. This was the second time. "Yes," I said. "You should have." We sat there for a while. Outside the garden was completely dark. Leonard poured the whiskey this time, and we drank it, and I stayed another night. And in the morning I called my solicitor, not for myself, but to ask, quietly, what Leonard's options were if Celia's actual living situation differed from what she'd disclosed. The answer was useful. Not dramatic. Just useful. The confrontation with Celia didn't happen at Leonard's instigation. It happened because I called her. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't for Leonard's benefit entirely. It was partly my own need to look directly at something rather than around it. I called her on Monday afternoon, driving home, and when she answered, I told her plainly that I knew she was living with Richard and that I thought she owed my father that truth, even now, even after the fact. There was a silence on her end that was longer than I expected. I know, she said. I was going to. When I said, I didn't know how to tell him without making it worse. It's already as bad as it's going to be, I said. The geography doesn't change the weight of it. It just means he's carrying it in the wrong shape. She called Leonard that evening. I don't know exactly what was said. He told me, briefly, on the phone 2 days later. She called. We talked. How are you? I said. Better, he said, which from Leonard meant something. My father is still in the house. It is the right outcome. He built it, lived in it for 40 years, and no legal challenge from Celia materialized, partly because the will had been changed before she could be said to have made any claim, and partly because Celia, in the end, wanted the new life more than she wanted the old argument. She has Richard's house and the garden and the version of herself she had apparently been moving toward for some time. I don't hate her for it. I came close to it in the months after. But hate requires a particular certainty about motive that I have gradually lost confidence in. Celia had been in a marriage that suited her until it didn't, and she found something that suited her better, and she handled the transition poorly. She was not calculating in the way that makes a person monstrous. She was afraid, and fear made her choose concealment over honesty, the way it does for most people who don't quite have the courage of their own decisions. What damaged Leonard was not the leaving. He is a man who can absorb hard truths when they're given to him clearly. What damaged him was the managed version, the sister's address, the extended timeline, the sense of being handled. He deserved the truth at its actual dimensions. He was given a smaller, more manageable shape of it. And that is a particular kind of disrespect that sits differently than the betrayal itself. The will is something I've made my peace with, though not without effort. Leonard has since told me, quietly, in the way he says things that cost him something, that he wants to revisit it. I told him that what he does with his house is his business, and that I hadn't come that weekend because of the will, and that those two things are both true and not contradictory. He heard that. Marcus and I are closer now than we've been since we were children. Not because of the crisis. Crisis doesn't automatically produce closeness. But because the weekend it came apart required us to be in the same room long enough to remember that we like each other. That we come from the same place, even if we've made different choices about where to live. He told me, one evening in December when we were both back at Leonard's for a Sunday dinner that had become, quietly, a new habit, that he'd felt guilty about the will from the moment he knew. Not guilty enough to tell you, he said, but enough. I know, I said. That's the difficult kind. What I carry from all of it. The inheritance shifted, the marriage ended, the geography of the grief concealed, is something that has taken months to articulate. It is this. The things that happen in families are rarely as simple as betrayal or loyalty or reward and punishment. They are layered decisions made under pressure by people who are afraid, people who are grieving, people who are protecting themselves or each other in ways that aren't always clean or fair. Leonard changed the will out of fear. Celia left for reasons that had been building for years before she understood them. Marcus stayed silent because honesty at someone else's expense is one of the hardest calculations there is. And I drove home from a hardware store and arrived at my father's house and found that the family I thought I knew was already something different, had been becoming something different for months, and that my distance, chosen, maintained, lived with, meant I was always going to be the last to know. I still live 2 hours away. That hasn't changed, but I go back more often now. I sit at the kitchen table with my father, and he tells me small things, the garden, the walking group he's rejoined, a program he watched, and I listen in the space between his sentences, and sometimes the space is smaller than it used to be. That is not nothing. In Leonard's language, that is quite a lot. This story operates through a structure of interconnected silences. What Leonard didn't say, what Marcus withheld, what Celia managed rather than disclosed, and the cumulative effect of those silences on a family that had never been particularly fluent in direct communication. From a psychological perspective, The most instructive element of Leonard's experience is not the betrayal of Celia's affair, but the secondary wound of the managed truth. He was told she had left. He was not told where she had gone. That gap, small on paper, enormous in practice, meant he spent 6 weeks processing a grief that was built on incomplete information. He was mourning the shape he'd been given, not the actual shape of the thing. This kind of partial truth is often intended as protection, and it often functions as the opposite. It places the grieving person in a landscape that doesn't quite correspond to reality, and when the real landscape eventually becomes visible, the disorientation compounds the original pain. At what point do you think Celia decided to protect herself with the sister's address rather than tell Leonard plainly where she was going? That choice, which probably felt, in the moment, like mercy, was ultimately an act of self-preservation dressed as consideration. She wasn't protecting Leonard. She was protecting herself from his response. Leonard's decision to change the will is psychologically fascinating precisely because it doesn't fit the narrative of the wronged spouse seeking revenge or reassurance. He did not change it to punish Celia or to signal pain. He changed it with the engineering logic of a man whose instinct, under pressure, is to structure and protect. He looked at what was still within his control, the material future of what he'd built, and he acted on it. The will was not about Marcus. It was about Leonard finding one load-bearing wall he could still reinforce while other things were falling. Emory's position in this story is worth examining separately because he is not the protagonist of the central crisis, but the person through whom it is understood. His distance from the family, geographical, but also emotionally calibrated, gave him the perspective that Marcus, too close to the situation, couldn't access. But it also meant he arrived after months of events had already formed their shape. Would you have stayed closer? And if you had, would you have seen it coming? Or simply been inside it without the distance to understand it? The decision to call Celia directly is the story's pivotal moment of agency. Emory did not do it on Leonard's instruction. He did it because honesty, even when it arrives late, has a different weight than continued management. His line, "The geography doesn't change the weight of it. It just means he's carrying it in the wrong shape," captures something essential. Grief requires accurate information to be processed. You cannot mourn correctly a thing you don't correctly understand.